My name is Jake Froyum. I'm the CFM forester for the Minnesota DNR out of Faribault, and I'm going to be talking to you folks today about restoring your woods after a buckthorn infestation. And kind of my background a little bit is I, before my employment with the Minnesota DNR, I worked for a number of years as a contractor doing buckthorn restoration. So I've done it both as a contractor doing the work, and now part of my job with DNR forestry is meeting with private landowners and helping them come up with a plan for their buckthorn, some technical assistance. And so I think this will be a good presentation to give you an idea more so on the follow-up part. I'm going to kind of go through the removal a little bit here, but I want to lean on the answering that question of what to do after your buckthorn infestation. With any sort of natural resource project, you need to do an initial assessment. You need to know what you have, what you're working with, and try to determine what's the right native vegetation for the site. With that, you're going to have to decide your removal strategy. There's a few different ways to do a buckthorn removal project, and depending on how you do that removal, it may impact what some of your follow-up work will be, or you may even alter your removal strategy to better facilitate some of your follow-up control strategies. And it leads us into our follow-up control. There's one of the most difficult issue with managing buckthorn isn't necessarily the initial removal. It is that control of the buckthorn seedlings and those small sapling, waist-high, pencil-size buckthorn that are kind of too small and numerous to cut and treat all those stumps, but are certainly vigorous enough that they just want to keep returning and coming back. Then we'll get into the seeding and planting. Do you need to add some more material back into this to get your native vegetation back onto the site, or will it recover on its own? And then getting into that long-term recovery, what can it look like? Is this even something that's sustainable in the future? Or is it even worth managing the buckthorn if you can't sustain it? And spoiler alert, I think you can recover these sites long-term, and I'll get into that a little bit here. So, when you're starting these buckthorn projects, here's two examples. This one on the left is a site in Egan, kind of a lower quality woods, high density infestation of buckthorn. You can just tell by looking at this, you've got a lot of work cut out for you in that follow-up vegetation that's going to recover on the site. It's probably going to take a while longer than this other site here out of Fillmore County on the right. There's buckthorn in there, but it's a lot lighter infestation. The cover of the woods around it, the mature trees are good desirable trees, and it's a healthy component. There's a good understory and a good ground layer of vegetation. So I think this one on the right would be a lot easier to recover long-term. So getting into our removal strategy, and like I said, I don't intend to go over today all the details about specifically how to cut buckthorn, what to treat it with, what's the best route to take for removal, but I do want to show some examples of what some of those different removal strategies are and how it might affect your follow-up work. These two photos here, the one on the left is what we call a cut slash. That's where buckthorn is cut off at ground level, the stump is treated, and all those buckthorn are cut up with the chainsaw into 3 to 4 foot lengths with a goal of getting all that cut material within knee to waist high of the ground so that snow can lay on it and get good ground contact. And with a few years, it can decompose and basically go away. This picture on the right there, this is actually the same site, but on some of the more level areas, a forestry mulcher mounted on a skid loader is brought in to grind that material to speed up that decomposition process to get the ground contact. So for some of the follow-up work, access is going to be easier and probably more effective. There's reasons you would do the cut slash though on the left. It certainly looks messy, but due to topography and site conditions and budgetary constraints, it's compared to, like, say, piling and burning, the cutting and slashing is fairly quick, and it's a good method, especially in lighter infestation situations. Here's an example of altering that removal technique to facilitate your follow-up management. This was a open oak woods, and you can see the buckthorn was hand cut, stump treated, and then left in long windrows with that forestry mulcher coming into the skid loader and grinding up all that material in place. And this is a site that fire was used as a follow-up tool on. So by getting rid of all that extra material, we were able to speed this whole recovery process up faster. And of course, you get into some sites like this here where it's high density, large diameter stems, and cutting, piling, and burning is kind of the way to go. This particular site, you can see by the height of the stumps, was cut this winter with deep snow. There was no equipment access in there due to the snow. So the cut material was just kind of left in piles. And here in the next few weeks, skid loader and a grapple will come in, pile and burn that material, and those stumps will be cut off short and treated with herbicide to prevent resprouting. So getting into that follow-up control, I'm going to some of the things I'm going to talk about here relate to using herbicide application. And assuming that all the large buckthorn over 1 inch diameter have been cut and removed, typically I take one growing season off. So if the removal was done during the winter, you wait for the full growing season because you will get a flush of seedlings to germinate. And by targeting those in the fall, you've got that seasonal timing where the plant activity of the buckthorn is green and active and your native plants have begun to go dormant. The advantage of that timing in the fall is it makes it a lot easier and more efficient for your identification of the buckthorn seedlings, and your non-target impact is reduced because a lot of your natives are beginning to go dormant, so they're not actively taking in herbicide. Some advantages of that, though, are the short timing window. There's maybe a 3 to 4 week period with that differential where you can still get good control. But going into fall, buckthorn does start to get reduced activity. And eventually, as you get closer to November, you will not get good uptake of your herbicide and good results. And anytime you're spraying, even with good rates and good selection of product, some non-target impact is still likely. So this photo here is an example of a site. You can see it was basically a carpet of buckthorn that came up afterwards. This site was sprayed in the fall with a foliar herbicide on the leaves, and 1 year later, going back out the next fall, this is what we saw. There's the line right here where off to the right, that was completely missed by the spray for some reason. It might have been applicator error. Sometimes it's hard to tell where you're spraying. But you can see there was pretty good control, but there's a numerous buckthorn popping up there in the left side of the picture. And what I believe is about 70% control per spray is a reasonable goal. If you're getting 100% control, you're probably over applying your herbicide. Your non-target impact will be higher, and you'll probably knock out some of your sedges, some of your native plants that are in there. On a site that's very degraded, though, that's a call you might make to go out there and really treat it like a site prep where you're fine with non-target impact because there's very few non-targets out there. Another great follow-up tool can be prescribed fire. So fire is best used in fire-adapted forest types and plant communities to control those young buckthorn. And while the young buckthorn is being controlled, the fire also stimulates growth and recovery of the fire-adaptive native species. Some advantages to fire is it does reduce your herbicide use. In fact, you can use a prescribed burn to replace one of your herbicide applications, or complement it, or even use the fire to set up a later herbicide application. Another advantage is if you are dealing with a site that has a lot of small diameter buckthorn that are, say 5 to 6 feet tall, too numerous to really effectively cut and stump treat all those, fire does a good job of top killing those. Although they will resprout, you can come back out and spray the follow-up foliar spray, and now you have more uniform target that's shorter, closer to the ground, and your spray application is a lot easier to spray something that's knee or waist high rather than something that's 5 or 6 feet tall. And like I mentioned, prescribed fire can stimulate some of those native plants that will in turn compete against the buckthorn down the road. Disadvantage, of course, is fire requires skilled people and the equipment. You really need to know what you're doing. And it doesn't work in all forest types. It's limited mostly to the fire adapted oak woods generally, and some of the lowlands, silver maple, even the big woods type woods typically are not a fire adapted cover type, and fire doesn't work real well in those. It's not necessarily the best decision. And another disadvantage is it's not acceptable everywhere. There's municipalities, neighbors, or situations where fire just is not a good tool to use. This is an example of a prescribed fire that was done on a kind of an open hillside with bur oak, some Siberian elm. You can see there's red cedar, there's buckthorn on it, and these little patches and openings of remnant prairie as well. Fire was used here. You can see on May 6th, the site burned quite well. And this picture here that I took on June 10th, so barely over a month later, you can see some of the results. Those native prairie plants and the vegetation there is really resprouted. It's coming up. It's nice and green. It's been invigorated. And you see some of the burned stems of buckthorn, and even closer to the ground, there's some red cedar that was burned off, these little foot tall red cedars. And you can see where the fire scorched the other red cedars too, which, that's not what this presentation is about, but you can see it also can be used to manage out other species that are not necessarily desired in your project. So seeding and planting, I often get asked the question, people have just done a buckthorn removal and they want to know what plants should I get, or what seed should I get to put in there, or how do I get these woods to recover? Typically, the answer is there's probably a lot more work to be done first. There's follow-up control, which could include the herbicide or burning or a number of different control methods. I typically recommend that you spend a few seasons really managing that buckthorn seedling component first. There's typically a 3 to 5 year life on the seed that's in a soil where it can germinate and come up. So by managing really heavily those first 3 to 5 years and getting ahead of the buckthorn situation, the likelihood of any new plants that you put in and not being killed by your management activities is a lot higher. So, if you decide to add some new plants or seed, what type, or how do you even get these plants and seeds? Well, you can determine what's appropriate for your site. And kind of the basic answer to that question is you can just take cues from similar areas of the forest in your area that have a lower infestation, might be in a healthier situation. Another great resource, if anybody's familiar with these books, it's the Native Plant Communities of Minnesota field guides. And in these books, we can dial in exactly what type of native plant community your woods is or is supposed to be. And using that guide, you can find the species frequency and cover to know what sort of plants should be found in the woods there. And it's kind of interesting. Oftentimes I'll use these guides as a way to reverse engineer a restoration. So I can look and know that in this particular situation, lady fern is very common, sweet cicely, wild geranium. And a lot of these plants are ones that are going to come back well on their own anyways, but this can give you some cues if you want to increase the diversity by trying to find some live plants or seed to add into your project. And like I said, if you add too early, you may end up killing them. So it's good to wait. And honestly, most forests have the ability to regenerate those trees, shrubs, and the herbaceous vegetation on their own without any new seeding or planting. And compounding that problem is just native woodland seed and plants are scarce. There's just not a lot availability for the seed out there. And live plants, there are some nurseries that carry it, but on any sort of scale, it's really tough to find enough to make a dent. That's where I recommend considering a local donor site. And what I mean, it might just be another healthy piece of woods on the same property, or another similar healthy woods in the area where you can ethically hand dig and transplant some native plants to get those started back on your project. And another thing to consider too is the shade tolerance. I've often been out and looked at projects where people have done a buckthorn project and they go and order a couple hundred seedlings from a nursery, put them in the ground, and then they're dead 3 or 4 years later. And it's because they didn't consider the shade tolerance. In April, when you get these trees and you're sticking them in the ground, there's a lot of sunlight reaching the forest floor, but by the time the leaves on the canopy trees fill in, now that sunlight is limited, and those trees a lot of times just end up dying. One thing to consider is planting larger containerized trees and shrubs in select areas. These are ones that you can mark and protect and avoid impacting them with some of your follow-up maintenance to kind of get that head start. And that works real well on smaller projects too, where you can afford to spend a little more time and effort on a few individual trees that you're adding to it. This is an example of a complete woodland installation project. This particular site here was a complete wall of buckthorn, small diameter, could not even walk through it. It was it's only about an acre and a half in size, but this project was cleared and there were some volunteers and some decent funding for this. And over the course of probably 5 to 7 years, this site was meticulously replanted with live plants, hand seeded, hand pulled, sprayed, and hours of work went into this simple acre and a half. You know, it's a commendable job. It's a great project, but it gives you an idea of how much work can be involved in just this little area. I have no doubt there's been several $1,000s of plant material put on there, and that's not considering any labor costs that would have gone into this. You know, so what is a sustainable buckthorn control project? And how I often define that is long-term. A sustainable project to me is you can go walk the woods during that fall timing differential period and easily identify any new buckthorn plants that may have germinated and come in over the last few years. So if you walk that woods every 2 to 3 years, maybe with a backpack sprayer or a little hand saw and a dauber to put some herbicide on the stumps, that to me is a sustainable site. And I have seen numerous sites get to that. It's not some sort of mythical thing that's just laying out there that nobody's actually done. It's certainly possible to get them to that, but it really depends on leaning heavy on these sites for those first 5 years roughly, and getting through the sapling control stage, those ones that keep getting bigger and are difficult to control. And of course, birds will bring in new seed, but if you're on top of these sites, you get out in your woods, walk them, and manage new ones that come in. I really believe that you can get on top of these. And as the site recovers and the vegetation fills in, it will be more resistant to any new infestations as well. This is an example right here of a site that some woods did some management on. This picture's from 2015. There was a lot of buckthorn in here, some red cedar, and a few other target species that were removed. You can see piled and burned, hauled off site. Since then, the site has been foliar sprayed in the fall at least 2 or 3 times and has had 1 prescribed burn on it as well. I looked at the site here a couple weeks ago. I did find a few buckthorn here and there, but they were few and far between. And you can see how it's recovered real well with some sedges and native vegetation. Of course, as you can tell in the picture, some of the site is really open. It's the plan is for this to be more of an open oak woods with fire as a management tool occasionally throughout the future. But this site has recovered remarkably well. Here's another site just to show you how fast a site can recover on their own. This is a before site, obviously. This particular property was in oak woods. It was pastured heavily for probably 50 plus years until the early 1980s. Cattle were pulled off of it, and by the mid to late 80s, a timber sale was done, and a large percentage of the oak was removed from the site. At that point, nothing was done in the woods, basically abandoned, and because after the timber sale, there was a lot more sunlight. The cattle were not in there eating any of the small buckthorn off, and the buckthorn just exploded. It was wall to wall with large diameter buckthorn. The understory was basically dirt. This is what it looked like after removal. You can see the stumps, that ground that looks like dirt. You can see in the background how dense this infestation is and how much work is left to be done. This was a pile and burn project because there's just way too much material to really do anything else with. And long-term, the landowner would like to use some prescribed fire to continue to control those buckthorn seedlings. Here's the first part of his project. And so this is only 1 year later. And in this area too, he was burning one of those burn piles. It got away from him and burned up about a quarter to a half acre of the woods. Nothing got hurt. It just ran into that other buckthorn that would not support a fire and went out. But you can see how quickly this is recovered after one growing season. From what was apparently dirt, there came up numerous native sedges. I've seen jack in the pulpit, wild geranium, bed straw, and some of these other real hardy native plants that tend to, they hang on in these tough conditions, and their seed tends to germinate and come up after they've been cleared and just given a chance. So this is a good example of something that looked like a pretty hopeless situation that I think this landowner, with the use of some herbicide and getting some prescribed fire back into the system, really has a bright outlook ahead of him. So, I mentioned that I'm here for technical assistance. Well, you need to decide when should you get help. Decide what your limits are for time, skills, and money. Far too often, when I was involved in the contracting side of the situation, or since I've been as a forester, I'll show up and the homeowner's been working on the same project year after year after year and not making much progress. That's where it can be worth spending the money and getting somebody in there to help, getting some neighbors to help, or finding a way to really make some headway on these projects. And then you need to decide what parts fit you to do yourself and what parts really should go to a contractor. For example, the prescribed burning, that's a great thing to turn over to a contractor to do. And some of that initial herbicide work, especially in situations where the buckthorn seedlings are thick and you may need an ATV, some long hoses, specific herbicide mixtures, and good timing. All that plays into fitting well with getting a contractor to help you. And for technical assistance, DNR foresters are ready and available to look at your site and give you some advice on what direction that we think you can go. There's certainly numerous private contractors out there across the state that have a lot of experience doing these projects and can give you some advice, as well as give you some bids and let you know how much this might cost. And there's other source of help would be like the soil and water conservation districts. They have an annual tree and plant sale. Can be a good way to purchase smaller numbers of trees and plants, something more specific for your location. The NRCS, and through the NRCS, there's EQIP program that has some cost share funds available for buckthorn removal. And checking with private nurseries to see what sort of plants that they may have that can work on your site, and get an idea of what you may want to add, what might not be available already on your site, that you can improve your diversity through plants from private nurseries. So that was kind of a quick rush through it. We could certainly talk about buckthorn for hours on end, but that's not really the point of this. I wanted to give you a feel for a general timeline, and that timeline is your initial removal. I want to reiterate that you want to lean heavy those first 3 to 5 years on managing the seedling component to get those out of the system and allow your woods to recover naturally on their own as much as they're capable of, and then look at supplementing that with additional seed and plant material. I thank you for listening to this, and if you would like to get a hold of me, my contact information is there, or feel free to look up other DNR foresters that could be helping for your particular area. Thanks again.